He walked into his own dealership dressed like a stranger. No one recognized him. And when he watched a racist salesman lie straight to a customer's face, he didn't shout. He didn't stop the sale. He just listened. Because what he did next would shake the entire place from the inside out. Watch this story until the very end. Because what happens in the final moments will show you the kind of justice that doesn't need to raise its voice. They thought he was just another man, maybe a drifter, maybe a pensioner clinging to a faded memory of horsepower and chrome. The sun bore down hard on the cracked asphalt outside Statham Motors, and the glass showroom windows glinted like they had something to hide. But behind the dusty cap and weathered jeans was a name no one in that building had dared to say in months. Jason Statham walked with the kind of silence that made noise unnecessary. No one noticed when he stepped onto the lot. That was the point. The front desk attendant glanced up, saw the scruff, the boots, the worn denim jacket, and didn't bother offering a greeting. A customer without buying power wasn't worth much attention in that place. Not anymore. That fact alone told him more than any report ever could. The last time Jason had stood on that lot, it had been opening day. He'd shaken hands, handed over keys, and promised this would be a dealership where honesty wasn't just a slogan. It was the standard. But that was a long time ago. Growth came fast, hands changed, and he'd stepped back to let the managers run it. What they built in his name. That's what he was here to see. He moved slow, scanning the rows of polished metal and carefully staged lighting. Every car looked too perfect, too spotless. The kind of clean that hides something underneath. He paused near a gleaming black SUV, just long enough to see the reflection of a salesman in the tinted window. The man was mid-30s, suit sharp, posture arrogant, teeth white enough to blind. His voice oozed charm, but only in one direction. The couple standing in front of him looked unsure. The man held a baseball cap in one hand. The woman kept looking at the floor. Their clothes were simple, clean, but not expensive. Latino, maybe. The salesman didn't ask for their names, didn't offer to shake a hand. He smiled with his mouth and not his eyes, and when they asked about financing options, his tone dropped just a notch, polite on the surface, dismissive underneath. Jason kept walking. Inside the showroom, the lighting changed. Cooler, harsher, the scent of leather and coffee mixed with cologne and ambition. Jason walked past a row of desks, each manned by a copy of the same mold. Tight haircuts, fitted blazers, voices like velvet on the outside and steel underneath. They didn't look up. He didn't want them to. Near the center of the room, a young woman organized a stack of brochures. Her name tag was crooked, her sleeves rolled up, and her eyes moved quickly, watching, not waiting. She noticed the couple the moment they walked in, and she noticed how the salesman shifted when he saw their skin, their hesitation, their questions. Her hands tightened when he cut them off mid-sentence, but she said nothing. Jason watched it all. He leaned casually against a pillar, half-shadowed by a fake ficus, and observed the rhythm of the place. Deals pitched in elevator tones, smiles that didn't reach the heart, laughter practiced enough to sound real, and always, Bryce, the lead salesman, talking louder than anyone else. The black SUV came back into view. Bryce led the couple toward it like a magician leading a mark. He opened the door with flair, quoted numbers too fast for a spreadsheet to keep up, and slipped in a detail Jason knew wasn't true. He said the engine had been replaced. Jason felt it in his chest. Not surprise, not anger. Something colder. He knew every service logged on that vehicle. He'd read the report himself 2 days prior. It had a tire rotation and a brake check. Nothing more. Bryce said the engine was brand new. Jason straightened slowly, walking toward the vehicle with the same posture he once brought into fight arenas. Silent, aware, calculated. He didn't stop beside the couple. He didn't interrupt. He waited until Bryce moved away to chase another lead, then placed his hand on the hood. It was cold, untouched. The woman, Sophia, he would learn later, glanced over from the reception desk. Their eyes met. Something passed between them. Not words, not even a nod, just the quiet recognition between two people who knew how to spot rot behind polish. Jason walked to the far corner of the showroom where a wall of awards hung in perfect symmetry. His name was on the first plaque. The year was faded now, but the promise it carried still lived in his chest. He turned just in time to see Bryce leading the couple away. Fast, forced, his voice louder than before. Sophia took a step forward, then stopped. Jason waited until the couple had left before walking up to the vehicle again. Bryce was now with a new customer, laughing as if nothing had happened. Jason leaned into the open driver's side and scanned the dash. No scent of recent cleaning, no signs of mechanical work, just an illusion of care. He walked to the back of the SUV and knelt. A small chip in the bumper had been hastily covered with touch-up paint. Amateur work, rushed, like everything else in the building. Then came the final moment that cemented everything. Jason watched as Bryce offered that same SUV to the new customer, only this time, no mention of an engine swap. Just low miles, single owner, serviced like new. The lies weren't just personal, they were strategic. Jason turned toward the hallway that led to the staff offices. He passed by rows of photos from launch day. His hand grazed the frame of one, he and the original crew, smiling, hopeful. Only two of those faces still worked here. In the hallway bathroom, he locked the door behind him. The mirror above the sink flickered with fluorescent light. He stared at his reflection. The cap came off. The jacket opened. The eyes staring back at him weren't tired. They were calculating. Jason exhaled once. This wasn't just about a sale. This was about something deeper, something that had rotted while he looked away. And now it was his name on every one of those lies. He turned on the water, washed the dust from his hands, and wiped his face with a paper towel. When he looked back into the mirror, the man staring back wasn't a customer anymore. He was the storm no one saw coming. He stepped out of the restroom and moved with purpose. He didn't speak to anyone as he crossed the showroom, didn't make eye contact, didn't smile, but his footsteps carried the weight of something final. He passed Sophia, who looked up, confused at first, then uncertain. He didn't stop. He walked straight toward the manager's office, and that's when the air in the room began to shift. Something had changed. No one knew yet, but they would. Jason placed his hand on the doorknob of the manager's office, and just before turning it, he glanced back, once, at Bryce, who was mid-laugh, mid-lie, mid-sell. Then Jason stepped inside, and behind that closed door, everything began to unravel. The office smelled like dust and old paperwork trying too hard to be relevant. The blinds were half closed, casting slatted shadows across the cluttered desk, where coffee-stained folders sat stacked beside a phone that hadn't rung all morning. Jason closed the door behind him, not slamming it, just pressing it into place with a slow, measured force that made the silence inside settle even heavier. He took a seat, not at the visitor chair but behind the desk. The room belonged to Elliot, the general manager, who wasn't in yet. But Jason knew the access codes. He knew the drawers. And more importantly, he knew what he was looking for. The file was there, exactly where it should be. Service records, complaint logs, internal notes flagged as non-urgent. Jason read in silence, eyes moving like a scanner set to uncover everything that shouldn't be there. Bryce's name came up more than once. Fast closer rates, minimal returns. But then came the margins between the lines. Client felt pressured. Refused to answer technical questions, felt dismissed. And one in handwriting Jason recognized. Referred to customer as not the right profile for this trim. Jason's jaw tightened. He remembered that phrase from a meeting 2 years ago. A manager had used it once, and Jason had nearly shut down the location. Now it lived in a complaint, brushed aside and buried beneath commissions and monthly targets. He closed the file and looked around the office. Diplomas, framed reviews, staff photos, all posed, all sanitized. Not a single frame showed a face that wasn't white. He stood, walked to the window and watched the showroom floor. Bryce was shaking hands again, but something in his body language had shifted. More cocky, more rehearsed. Like he knew he couldn't be touched. But then Jason's eyes landed on her again. Sophia. She stood behind the reception desk, flipping through a binder, pretending to organize the paperwork, but her eyes weren't reading. They were watching, tracking, calculating just like his had been. She had seen everything. Jason walked out of the office and back toward the service kiosk. The path was short, but it felt longer now. Every step echoed louder than it should have. The kind of echo that didn't come from the floor, but from memory. He passed the black SUV again. Bryce had left it gleaming, staged, waiting to trap another story in its false polish. Jason paused at the rear of the vehicle. He crouched low, ran his hand beneath the bumper. The sensor cover was loose, likely dislodged during transport. The engine hadn't been replaced, it hadn't even been removed. A lie wrapped in chrome. He stood just as Sophia rounded the corner from the file room, holding a maintenance log in her hands. Her steps were tentative, but her eyes were focused. She crossed the floor quietly, slid behind her desk, and placed the binder down with more care than she needed to. Jason walked past, slow, deliberate, as if his presence itself were a test. He stopped at the SUV again, opened the driver's side door, and let the leather smell hit him. No grease, no signs of mechanical work, just a staged display. No fingerprints, no mechanic's residue, nothing. And then Bryce returned, loud, bright, selling another dream. Different customer now, older man, gray slacks, gold watch. Bryce was full of stories again, but this time the story was different. This time there was no mention of an engine swap. Jason listened from behind the vehicle as Bryce described a clean maintenance history, a single-owner vehicle and limited upgrades. A different version for a different customer. Race, income, posture, it all determined the script. It wasn't just racism, it was targeted deception. Jason stepped back from the SUV and walked to the edge of the showroom, then paused beside a row of chairs where clients waited for service updates. He scanned the papers on the nearby clipboard. Service requests, tire balances, oil changes, nothing on that SUV. He took a deep breath and looked back across the floor. Sophia had left the reception desk. She stood near the service hallway, glancing between Bryce and the SUV. Then, for a brief moment, their eyes met again. Jason reached into his jacket pocket, pulled out a folded piece of paper, scribbled something in clean block lettering, and walked toward the desk. Sophia returned a second later, surprised to see the note placed neatly beside the phone. Jason was already gone. She opened the note carefully. It read, "Don't let them silence you. Check the maintenance file for that SUV. Trust your instinct." She looked up. Jason had stopped near the manager's office again, pretending to glance at his phone, but he wasn't looking down. He was watching Bryce. Sophia took a breath and disappeared into the file room again. Jason remained still. The customer Bryce was selling to smiled, nodded, shook his hand. Another sale in motion, but something had shifted. Jason could feel it. When Sophia returned, her steps were faster. Her binder was closed tight. She walked directly to the rear office corridor, not looking at anyone, vanishing into the hallway like she didn't want to be stopped. Jason followed seconds later, pacing his steps just enough to avoid suspicion. In the hallway, he heard movement behind the service bay door. He turned a corner just in time to see Sophia stop near the mechanics station. A man in coveralls greeted her with a nod. Jason leaned silently against the wall just out of view. Sophia asked for confirmation. Jason couldn't hear every word, but the body language said enough. The mechanic's shrug, his shake of the head, the way he pointed to a clipboard and flipped pages. Jason watched from the shadows as the truth unfolded. She turned, her expression now calm, focused, like someone who had known the answer, but needed to see it anyway. As she walked back toward the showroom, Jason stepped away from the wall and vanished back into the front of the building. Bryce was finishing his pitch. Another handshake, another smirk. Another line about fast deals and don't wait too long. Jason moved toward the SUV again, arms crossed, expression unreadable. And then Sophia stepped into view, binder in hand, knuckles white against the cover. She didn't walk back to the desk. She walked toward Bryce. Jason didn't need to hear her voice to know she was speaking. The look on Bryce's face shifted from confusion to discomfort to fury. His smile tightened. His posture turned defensive. The customer stepped back slightly. Sophia handed over the file. Bryce didn't take it. Jason did. He opened it slowly, flipping through the sheets. Brake service, tire rotation, cosmetic detailing, no engine replacement, no rebuild, no shop invoice, nothing. He held the file up just long enough for Bryce to see it, then closed it with quiet finality. The customer looked confused, then concerned. Bryce opened his mouth, but no words came out. Jason walked toward the SUV one last time, gently placing the folder on the hood. He didn't speak. But he turned, slowly, deliberately, and walked across the showroom floor. Sophia stood in place. Bryce remained frozen. Jason moved like gravity itself, and just as he reached the far end of the room, he placed one hand on the edge of the front counter and scanned the space, every inch of it. Then, without a word, he turned toward the back of the building and made his way toward the staff conference room. He wasn't going to raise his voice. He didn't need to. Inside the conference room, Jason opened a cabinet, pulled out a file labeled Internal Compliance, and laid it across the table like a loaded weapon. Through the glass, he watched Bryce still trying to recover his smile. But Jason knew, within the next hour, the entire dealership would know the truth. And someone was going to answer for every lie spoken under his name. The blinds in the conference room vibrated gently against the glass, as if the air inside had thickened with expectation. Jason stood alone, hands resting on the Internal Compliance folder, its edges slightly curled from disuse. For a long moment, he didn't move. He simply stared down at the table, absorbing the silence before the storm. He wasn't here for drama. He wasn't here to fire someone and disappear into a press release. He was here to shift the soul of something he had built with his bare hands. But that kind of change didn't come with announcements. It came with precision. It came with exposure. Outside the conference room, the floor moved like a stage not yet aware of its curtain call. Bryce had recovered his swagger. The customer had left. No sale, but no scene. Just another missed opportunity he would chalk up to someone else's fault. Sophia sat at her desk again, expression unreadable, but her movements held a new kind of tension, like a quiet defiance had taken root. Jason stepped out of the room and crossed the floor slowly. He didn't need to summon anyone. The moment he appeared with the file in hand, eyes followed him. Curiosity first, then the flicker of concern, then the realization that whatever was about to happen was not part of anyone's daily routine. He stopped near the reception counter and turned toward the staff. His presence drew them in one by one. Salesmen peeled away from their desks. Mechanics emerged from the hallway with sleeves rolled and expressions confused. The assistant manager entered from the finance office, tapping his phone until he looked up and saw the look on Jason's face. He froze. Even Bryce hesitated before joining the circle forming near the center of the showroom. His smile had returned, but not its confidence. Not this time. Jason waited until the room quieted. No one spoke, not even the receptionist. And then, with the weight of someone who had been silent far too long, he began to walk. Not pacing, not circling, just walking forward slowly, letting the tension build with every step. He raised the file and opened it, not dramatically, not to perform, but to reveal. Service logs, complaint notes, audit inconsistencies. The truth laid bare, line by line. He pointed to the black SUV still parked under the fluorescent lights. He let the silence do what shouting never could. The team looked at each other, some in confusion, some in guilt, a few in shame. Bryce shifted his weight from foot to foot, still defiant, but now visibly sweating. Jason flipped to a page near the back. There, under Bryce's name, was the written claim: engine replaced, certified by technician. The signature was sloppy, and Jason knew the mechanic listed had been out sick the entire week the car arrived. He closed the folder again. Then he looked straight at Bryce. There was no accusation in his voice, only the kind of certainty that made denial irrelevant. Bryce tried to interject, maybe to spin, maybe to distract, but the words never left his throat. Jason had already moved on. He turned to the group as a whole. There were no lectures, no theatrics, just truth, delivered with the same gravity that had once drawn crowds to watch him in silent awe on screen. And now that same energy filled the room, not with applause but reckoning. He pointed to the file, to the SUV, to the invisible weight of every manipulated deal and every silenced whistle. And then, he turned to Sophia. She stood at the edge of the group, hands clasped, face unreadable but proud. Jason lifted the file toward her and held it out, not as punishment, but as validation. Her truth, now official. She stepped forward and accepted it, not hesitantly, not with fear, but with the quiet grace of someone who had finally been heard. Bryce's jaw clenched. Jason didn't look at him again. Instead, he turned and walked toward the staircase that led to the upper observation floor. From there he could see the entire showroom, the polished surfaces, the curated lighting, the faces of people who had forgotten what it meant to sell with honor. He watched them from above like a man seeing his legacy from a distance. He had once envisioned this place as more than a dealership. He had imagined it as a symbol, a place where every customer, regardless of race, background, or income, was treated with the same respect, where sales came from trust, not tactics. But now, as he stood overlooking the sales floor, he saw how easily the dream had been hijacked by comfort and commissions. The door behind him opened. It was the regional manager, Frank, a man in his 50s who wore tailored suits like armor and cologne like confession. He had been at lunch when the shift began. Now he was catching up too late. Jason didn't turn when Frank greeted him. He didn't need to. The sound of his voice, the stammer in his tone, it all confirmed what Jason had already suspected. Frank had known. Not everything, but enough. Enough to keep the machine running. Enough to stay quiet. Frank began explaining, justifying, rationalizing. He spoke about numbers, about quarterly growth, about how Bryce closed better than anyone. Jason listened without nodding, without blinking, and then, after a long pause, he spoke. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't threaten. He simply described what he had seen, what had been allowed, what had been ignored. And with every word, Frank's shoulders slumped just a little more. Jason reminded him that trust was not a byproduct of success. It was the foundation of it. That reputation wasn't something built on good months, but on good people. And that every unchecked lie was a crack in the foundation they pretended was solid. Frank said they could do better. Jason said they had to. He walked past him, down the stairs again, and straight toward the back hallway. He found Sophia at her desk, still holding the folder, now slightly bent at the edges from her grip. Jason nodded to her once, just enough for her to feel it, to know that what she did mattered. He stepped behind the counter, retrieved the dealership's public file folder, and made a quiet adjustment. He took Bryce's photo down from the top performer wall and slipped it into a drawer. He replaced it with a blank frame, a reminder that results without ethics are nothing. Then he walked toward the front doors of the dealership. The sunlight outside hadn't changed, but everything inside had. Jason paused at the threshold. He could hear the whispers behind him, the unspoken shift in posture, the realization that something fundamental had just ended, and something else had begun. As Jason reached for the door handle, he heard Sophia's voice behind him, steady, clear. She said only one sentence, and whatever it was, it made Jason stop mid-step. He didn't turn around, but the grip on the handle tightened, and in that second, he knew. This wasn't over yet. He didn't move right away. Her voice still echoed in the space behind him, calm but resonant, a thread of truth tying everything together. Jason stood at the threshold of the glass doors, one hand still gripping the handle, the other resting loosely by his side. The words she had spoken weren't loud. They didn't need to be. They were enough to stop him cold. He turned slowly, his boots making no sound on the polished showroom floor. Sophia stood near the reception counter, not retreating, not apologizing, just standing, as if the weight of silence had finally shifted off her shoulders and now sat squarely where it belonged, on the system that ignored her for too long. Jason's eyes locked on hers for a moment. He gave no reaction, no approval, no reward. Just presence, just acknowledgement. And then, without another word, he walked back across the room. This time, not as a shadow, but as the weight of change itself. He entered the manager's office where Frank had been waiting, sitting upright, trying to look composed, but his nervous tapping betrayed him. Jason didn't sit. He didn't need to. He simply stated the facts. The dealership had drifted, leadership had failed, and the standard had been quietly lowered to a place where lies were normalized and prejudice was tolerated. Jason detailed each misstep, how complaints had been ignored, how staff had been silenced, how Bryce had been allowed to grow roots in soil that should have never accepted him. Frank tried to explain, but Jason raised one hand, barely, and the room fell still again. This wasn't about excuses. It wasn't about optics or PR plans. It was about truth. Jason informed Frank with no hesitation that Bryce was terminated effective immediately, not because of one lie, not even because of the racism Jason had personally witnessed, but because Bryce had done all of it under Jason's name. That was the part that couldn't be forgiven. Frank nodded slowly, the weight sinking in. Jason continued, stating that a full audit would be conducted and that every member of leadership would be reevaluated, not based on sales, but on integrity, on the choices they made when no one was watching. Then Jason paused. He reached into the file cabinet and pulled out an old envelope, yellowed and almost forgotten. Inside it was a copy of the original employee manifesto, the code of conduct Jason had written when the first dealership opened. He placed it on the desk in front of Frank. "You forgot this," he said, not in words but in presence. Then he left the office. He walked out onto the floor with the envelope still in hand and stopped in front of the sales team, the mechanics, the assistants, the reception staff, all of them now quiet, alert, caught in a moment that none of them had rehearsed for. Jason held up the folded paper and told them what it meant, again not through voice but through presence. He unfolded it, and instead of reading, he handed it to Sophia. She opened it carefully, her fingers pausing on the creases of old ink. Her eyes scanned the familiar words. Then she looked up. Jason nodded once, a gesture that said more than approval. It said responsibility. He turned to the rest of the floor and issued no commands. He gave no rousing speech. But everyone in the room felt it. The rules had changed. He walked toward the top performer wall again. The blank frame he'd placed earlier still hung there, clean, untouched. Jason removed it and reached into the small filing drawer behind the counter. From a folder marked Employee Recognition, he pulled a name tag. It was Sophia's. Without ceremony, he placed it behind the glass and mounted the frame again. One silent motion, one undeniable shift. No clapping, no music, just a single nod of respect, and the quiet understanding that honesty had just become visible. He turned back, made eye contact with every person in the room. He didn't need to ask if they understood. They did. Jason walked to the delivery bay. In the back corner, the couple who had been dismissed earlier was sitting quietly, waiting to hear back about financing they'd never be offered. They hadn't noticed the ripple their visit had caused. They had no idea who had been watching. Jason walked up to them slowly. No cameras, no titles, no announcements. He simply handed over a set of keys, not to the black SUV that had been falsely pitched to them, but to a newer model, upgraded, safer, untouched by lies. Their faces shifted from confusion to disbelief, and then to quiet gratitude. Jason didn't explain. He just nodded once and walked away. The new receptionist looked up as he passed. Jason paused at the counter and reached into the drawer where the dealership kept business cards. He pulled one out and flipped it over. On the back he wrote 5 words. Let the truth sell itself. He placed it face up on the counter, visible to everyone, and then he walked toward the exit again. This time when he reached the glass doors, no one called him back, because they all knew. He had already said everything he needed to, not with speeches, not with threats, but with action. As he stepped into the sunlight, the dealership behind him began to move again, but differently. The rhythms were slower, more deliberate, the smiles less forced, the conversations more human. And in the service bay, Sophia stood with a clipboard, speaking to a technician. Her shoulders were squared, her eyes clear. Her name now carried weight, not because it had been handed to her, but because she had earned it. Jason paused at the sidewalk, looking back one last time. Not to check, not to second guess, just to see. And what he saw wasn't a dealership. It was the start of something worth saving. As Jason stepped into his car and started the engine, the radio came on, static at first, then the slow rise of an old soul melody humming through the dash. He didn't change the station. He just drove, knowing that sometimes justice doesn't speak. It shows up quietly and changes everything. He didn't ask for applause. He didn't fire with fury. He just made sure the truth replaced every lie, and the person they once overlooked became the one who changed everything. If this story moved you, if you believe that silent justice speaks the loudest, then hit the like button, subscribe for more stories like this, and share it with someone who still believes that integrity matters. Because sometimes the quietest man in the room is the one rewriting all the rules.